By all means marry. If you're lucky, you'll have a good wife and be very happy. If you're not so lucky and have a bad wife, you become a philosopher.
This is Common Sense Generation. Common Sense Generation.
Hi guys, my name is Kądzielska-Koper. This is Common Sense Generation, and we have here with us Guy Pinsent. And what is very interesting about him, he is a descendant of David Hume. Guy, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you for welcoming me on your show. Great honor to be here.
As I mentioned at the beginning, you're much thinner than David Hume.
Well, David Hume was a man who very much enjoyed life. And one of my favorite quotes from him is, by all means philosophize, but above all, be a man. And he lived that way. He loved roast chicken and socializing. He was one of the most popular dinner party guests of his time. He was known as Le Bon David, very friendly, happy chap. Who he noticed that other philosophers around him and before him might have been very clever and intellectual, but weren't very nice. And he realized and wrote about this point about to convince somebody you have to empathize with them. And the humanity of David Hume was off the charts.
British empirism, so experiencing things, at least in this case. But of course, David Hume's impact is huge, and he created part of the philosophy which is still, let's say, relevant until today. And as I checked, because I didn't know this before, but it's 2048 years since he died. But of course, we still come back to this huge tradition which he started. But he was not only a philosopher, but he was also a mathematician as an economist. And those are his ideas, which I would say are very, very relevant until today and extremely important. And I know that you are very good in economics and statistics as well.
I wouldn't say very good. I maybe know just enough to be dangerous, but...
Just enough to be dangerous.
Like any subject, the more you think you know, the more you realize you don't know. And I think we should always start in philosophy with Socrates' great quote, the only thing I really know is I don't know anything at all. That's my second favorite quote from Socrates, by the way. My favorite is, by all means marry. If you're lucky, you'll have a good wife and be very happy. If you're not so lucky and have a bad wife, you become a philosopher.
He became a philosopher after all. His famous Xanthippe apparently was a bad wife, but on the other hand, imagine they had so many children and he was out there on a square all the time philosophizing or going to parties. This needed to be annoying. So just to excuse her a little bit in this case. But tell us, of course, a little bit about your personal story.
Well, I'm a Brit. I'm 16 or 17% Scottish, from the David Hume side of the family, who was a Scot born near Edinburgh and spent most of his life in Edinburgh. I've been living in Poland now for 20 years. I originally came here as a diplomat in 2003, just before Gulf War II kicked off, working in the British Embassy here. 2 years of wonderful posting here, loved it, met lots of fascinating people, traveled to all corners of this beautiful country, and decided this is where I'd like to maybe start a new career path and try my hand at real estate investment and development. So one thing led to another. I came back after a brief stint back in London at the Foreign Office headquarters. I resigned from the Foreign Office in summer 2006. I moved back here 18 years ago and got into property and property development.
There is this trend right now. It doesn't surprise that many people that people are actually immigrating the other way around. But in 2006, it needed to be a surprise that you were moving to Poland instead of wanting to get out of Poland. But as we're talking about common sense, now Eastern Europe or Central and Eastern Europe are becoming a place for at least a middle class and higher, lower middle class, higher middle class can live a normal life without and exist also in the public sphere, which becomes more and more difficult in the Anglo-Saxon world or in the rest of the Western world. Do you see it so?
Absolutely, you're quite right. When I moved back here 18 years ago, people were sort of smirking and saying that's rather strange because all the Poles seem to be leaving and moving to Britain and other countries in the West. And these push and pull factors are perfectly normal and go with where people see themselves as having better chances in life. And as you quite rightly mentioned, Poland has grown enormously. It is now a wealthy country. It made a lot of fanfare in the news earlier this year that under the current growth trajectories, income per capita in Poland will reach the same level as income per capita in Britain in only 5-6 years' time, by 2030. So when you think about that, it's quite incredible. And but the real question is why?
Exactly, this is a real question. Why it's a different way of rowing?
I think it's very, very simple. Poland is attractive for investors and attractive for people to work because it has relatively small government. Go back to David Hume and look at his political economy essays. Look at his essay on monetarism, or an essay called Of Money, which was the foundation of monetarism, where he explains very simply how a state, a government, can create lots of cash and spend more cash and pump up the economy. And that works in the short term, lots more cash going around. But using very rudimentary statistics in his day, in the mid-18th century, he was able to show that quite naturally, when you have more cash chasing essentially the same amount of goods and services, the only escape outlet is inflation.
It's inflation, exactly.
And inflation then ramps up, therefore the money ends up buying the same amount of stuff, and all you end up with is a bigger state, more state involvement in the economy. And we can show through empiricism, looking at the data, an inductive process of having a hypothesis, looking at the data, analyzing the data, and seeing what the results are versus your hypothesis. The British empiricism started by John Locke, taken forward by Hume and Berkeley. We can see that every time the government does something instead of the private sector, it is way less efficient.
Definitely, this is...
And so Poland has a much smaller state relative to the British state, which has now the highest levels of taxation since World War II, and is just going to get worse and worse under this current crazy left government that just got into power.
It seems very strange and also difficult to comprehend, because everything what Eastern Europe is running away from is this history of a huge state created by communists, or a lot of everything was not allowed, and small private entrepreneurs existed in Poland, but they were the source of wealth. So when there was a freedom or and a change of the system, people wanted to start their businesses. They wanted to have their businesses, but this, let's say, what they wanted to achieve was going on in UK. But then UK or the Western world, and especially Anglo-Saxon, why it's important? It's important because what happens in US and in UK affects the whole world because of the culture. English is the modern Latin. We all use it. We all participate in Anglo-Saxon culture, and that's why whatever happens there very quickly happens in other countries as well. That's why we are also allowed to criticize what's going on there, because we somehow are taking part in it.
Well, I think you're absolutely right, Maria, and we have to come back to this point about Poland growing strongly and growth in Britain, France, Germany stagnating. Why is this? And for me, it's very simple. We are forgetting in Britain, or the political leadership in Britain is forgetting about the Enlightenment values of David Hume and Adam Smith and these other great minds of the 18th century, well, going back to the beginning, so the end of the 17th century and stretching into the 19th century is this period which got designated by 20th century historians as the Enlightenment. Thanks to these brains and minds with great advances in science and thought, philosophy, and importantly, political economy, the world growth and wealth took off, manifestly. And if you don't believe it, I look no further than a wonderful book by Professor Steven Pinker called Enlightenment Now, where he lays out all the data, all these indices of human well-being, not just income, but infant mortality rates and so on. And wherever you look around the world, we've never had it better, or we had never had it better up until about 2020 in the West. For me, the turning point, the high watermark of the Enlightenment and now decline, as far as I can see right now, was the George Floyd murder and the rise of Black Lives Matter with their crazy Marxist, openly Marxist views, going for, burn it all down and start again type view, which manifestly is probably not a good idea. And Poland has resisted that.
In some
Poland
way,
is keeping its borders,
safe.
More or less safe, certainly compared to Britain. And we don't have, so far as I'm aware, this sort of policing of thought now, which we have in Britain, where you are being thrown in jail if you make an offensive comment on social media.
Which is obviously ridiculous, and which also kills all the diversity in a way. So this is an opposite goal which it's supposed to be protecting. So coming back to David Hume, so what would David Hume, when he looks right now at Britain, and Britain is sort of on fire, what he would say about it?
Gosh, how long do we have? From one perspective, actually, obviously David Hume was born into a very sort of turbulent world. He was born in 1711. There was a very bloody revolution and settlement with Scotland in 1707. But just give you some context as to how crazy times were, there was still obviously judicial murder, i.e. executions of witchers in Hume's early years. The last person executed for witchcraft, burnt alive, was in 1727 when Hume was 16 years old. But a woman was murdered for the crime of turning her daughter into a pony. Very obvious indicator of witchery. So these are crazy, superstitious times. But Hume's life, apart from the 7 Years' War in France, was relatively settled. Although in the 1760s, early 1770s, there were some pretty nasty riots as well, known as the Wilkes and Liberty riots. This was after John Wilkes, who was a politician but also published a satirical newspaper, published an article criticizing the king, making fun of him, suggesting that the settlement with France after the 7 Years' War was too lenient on France. And this created a huge freedom of speech row. And John Wilkes was thrown in jail, and that created riots, and they got very violent. I think 7 people were shot dead. So he was fighting for freedom of the press and freedom of speech. So from a certain perspective, David Hume, as he's turning in his grave, would look at the riots we've just seen in Britain and say, well, to quote Shakespeare, "'Twas ever thus." Here we are again, debating freedom of speech, something which I grew up taking for granted. And I've learned, particularly in the last few years, that these so-called freedoms are not innate. We have to stand up for them and fight for them. And again, coming back to our original point about Poland's success and wealth today and relatively high growth continuing today, I would love to see Polish politicians stand up and shout even more loudly for these values of freedom, Enlightenment values, and resisting restrictions on freedom of speech, because that ultimately is what allows us to develop and move forwards. If someone says something we don't like, society can ostracize them. You don't have to throw them in jail and spend police time checking social media posts.
This is absolutely, of course, ridiculous. But in Hume's time, there was still experience of death was more popular, of course, and because of the of course lower medical health, but also the rate of death of children. Usually, families had more children, and some of them died. So, but this thing that they needed to have a back in their mind all the time, something which reminded them that they are mortal. And this danger and the fact that they can somehow have a normal life is a blessing.
Yes.
We in the Western world, especially for the last, let's say since the end of the World War II, and mostly the part of the Western world, we of course forgot that we are mortal in this case. That it seems like the war is never going to happen. It seems, of course, there was this huge promise of Fukuyama that every country is going to embrace democracy and they're going to flourish and cooperate together. There will be no violence anymore at all.
Yes.
And a lot of countries believed in this. And I think a lot of people in Western societies believed in this truly. And a break or wake up from this maybe was a little bit through the COVID pandemic, but on a certain level. But for people in the Eastern Europe, there was always one thing in danger of Russia, and Russia is a real danger of like bringing back that, there is a risk which can bring our everyday life, which is a peaceful life, to the end. And this is the risk of being invaded somehow by Russians, because our grandparents already experienced this. Britain had never had this experience since the
1066.
Exactly.
Yes. Well, you're touching on lots of very interesting points, Maria, there. Just to sort of touch on and come back to a couple of them. First of all, this idea of our mortality, and I guess you're touching on David Hume and his views on religion. And he was, of course, a famed skeptic, and he was turned down a professorship at the University of Edinburgh because he refused to teach a theology course. He just wouldn't toe the line. He stood up for what he believed in. Now would it be
the other way around, probably, if he tried to teach something of this?
Quite possibly, but I think there's a deeper point here, and what Hume was really suggesting was that he pointed out various inconsistencies in religious faith. At best, he was a theist, which means maybe there's a God, but it doesn't affect me very much. But what is most interesting, for me at least, with David Hume, was how his philosophy of essentially suggesting that there's no point arguing with somebody on the basis of rational thought when there's a strong belief, means that we should actually have religious tolerance.
I see what you mean, yes.
And so it's the basic rule was, and for me one of the greatest Enlightenment values is, I don't really care very much what you do as long as you don't hurt me or impinge on my freedoms, and that should be reciprocal.
Fully agree.
Simple and great, but amazing how we're seeing the opposite of that right now from the political leadership in Britain, for example.
When we so much want to impose our views on others and make them our way around. So, yeah. And those are actually religious concepts a little bit. This is a form of inquisition, but without a transcendent.
Exactly. So you could say, for example, that this sort of net zero goal in Britain is the new religion. And, you know, one of my favorite quotes of David Hume would be, a wise man proportions his belief to the evidence. And I think David Hume, and he's cited by the late, great Nigel Lawson in his wonderful book, published I think in about 2009, looking at climate change. So Nigel Lawson, the great Chancellor of the Exchequer, the right hand of Margaret Thatcher, that reset Britain from a mess at the end of the 70s and turned the ship around in the 80s, by going for smaller government and fostering enterprise and entrepreneurship. As a retirement job in the early noughties, Nigel Lawson got interested in all of this climate change discussion, let's say, and he sat down and looked at everything and looked at the evidence, and he wrote a great book called An Appeal to Reason, a cool look at global warming. And in this he lays out the data, and so many points he makes, he just quietly dismantles the arguments and cites David Hume when he talks about effectively discount rates of future outcomes. David Hume, he quotes as, the quote goes along the lines as a man or a family during their life will obviously look after their immediate spouse and children, maybe a nephew, maybe a cousin, maybe a best friend, but there's certainly no provision made for great-grandchildren or beyond. And this is one way of pointing out how the climate alarmists are getting it all wrong. And Nigel Lawson, for example, points out that under the worst case predictions in 80 years' time, which in itself is a nonsense to predict 80 years out in advance on economics, the poorest countries in the world today in Africa will be 6.5 times better off than they are today under the worst case scenario, instead of 7 times better off if the worst case scenario does not come to pass.
So that's absolutely ridiculous when we look at from this perspective, and this is a lack of common sense and lack of evidence, but it becomes a religion, as you mentioned. So we want to avoid, and people who are believing it, I think they just want to have this moral good feeling that they are doing something right, giving up their car, getting on bike, not allowing other people to use this car, or forcing them to sell their old cars and buying bigger and new ones, which production also costs and everything. But for making them morally safe, for making them like feeling that they did something for others, which is of course ridiculous. But we wrap up and we put a point here. Guy, it was extremely interesting to listen to you and to have this conversation. And I do hope that you, the viewers of Common Sense, you really like this dosage of common sense which you just had. And I also would like to thank Polish National Foundation for making this video podcast possible.
This is Common Sense Generation.